No role plays, no conference calls, no BS. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader. This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, on this episode, we're going to be going over part 3 in this series, talking about how to get noticed by your boss's boss. For those of you who have not joined us for the last 2 weeks, this started out as a listener question where someone wrote into us asking how to get noticed by people in the organization above just who their direct supervisor or direct boss was, if that person just wasn't doing the things that they felt were needed in order to get them noticed. You know, if they were just kind of either not focusing on developing their people or not focusing on promoting their people from a verbal standpoint or a visibility standpoint. You know, how do people kind of take charge of this on their own if it's not being done for them? We've talked about things on the last 2 Mondays, things like knowing your numbers, taking ownership of your work, focusing on your team success, following through on commitments. On this episode, the 2 things that I want to talk about are thinking strategically and changing the ways that you do things because they've been done a certain way for a long time and no one's really looked into them for a while. So, trying to find a kind of a new solution to do something that was that's been an old problem. I think this is a really important episode when it comes to this because this is where the rubber meets the road. Thinking strategically and finding new ways of doing things that have been done a certain way for a long time. That's how change begins, when it comes to changing things about an organization or the way people do things in a way that gets other people to notice as opposed to, just something that you do for yourself.
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about this, and specifically around strategic thinking. Like, I think sometimes it's one of those terms that gets tossed around a lot without any real dialogue around, like, what does that actually mean? How does that actually show up? What are you actually doing? And the other cool part is so far we've heard from our listeners, they really appreciate, like, the conversation that we're having, because even though the context is like your boss's boss or other people in the organization, this is also really helpful in just continuing to shape the way in which you go about doing the work in the right way, but in a way that allows you to be authentic, in a way that allows you to, to not kind of get caught up in the machine of the way that everybody else does things. So, like, I really like these 2 topics because I think this, to your point, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where we start to really dig into, like, what do we mean by that, and how does that show up? You hear the term strategic thinking, like, is that just by myself in my own brain? Like, how do I actually bring that to life, and where are those types of spaces that I can show up with this type of skill?
Right. So when I think about it, we've talked in the past about the balance between strategic work and tactical work, and how the further up you move in an organization, the more your role becomes strategic and the less it becomes tactical. You're not doing, you're more creating the ways people will do things. And if you're trying to get noticed by your boss's boss and you're trying to think more strategically, that implies that a large part of your business still is tactical. There's still stuff you have to do every day. And so thinking strategically doesn't mean you stop doing your job in order to do somebody else's job in the hope that you get noticed doing somebody else's job. It means, you have to balance it. You have to continue to do your job well while thinking strategically. But I look at this as like how do you have a macro view at something while still executing on the micro level? And so think about, like, on a very basic level, think about like an assembly line worker whose job it is to use a ratchet on the same bolt on the same piece of equipment every single day as the things move down the assembly line. Well, what if there's something that breaks down before it gets to that person and the nut and the bolt aren't there? Do they continue to move their arm in that circular motion even though there's nothing there to turn? Or do they go, wait a minute, there's a problem here. Let's take a step back and look. And I'm using a very simple, stupid example because nobody would do that. But people do that all the time when it comes to, bigger issues. They continue to move forward in the way they've always done things without thinking about, wait a minute, has something changed, or is something different here, or can I make something different here to make this better? Is there a way to make it so this bolt and nut turn itself so that no one has to do this part of it anymore and we can focus on more important things? Is there a way to automate this? Is there a way? There's a lot of ways to think strategically about a problem while still continuing to solve that problem in the way you've been tasked with doing it. And quite honestly, the people who are tasked with solving the problem in the moment are probably the best people to think strategically about ways to solve it because they're the ones doing it every day. Oftentimes in multi-level organizations, there can be a real valid complaint that things coming down the pipeline where someone else has thought strategically and now you have to execute, that it was created by somebody who has never walked a mile in your shoes, someone who's never done your job. That's a very real complaint by a lot of people in a lot of organizations. So then change it. You be the one to think strategically, because if you're the one who's closest to the execution of it, then you should be the one at least contributing to the conversation.
Yeah, no, and I think it's like I even think about in places where you're maybe on conference calls or video calls or whatever, where you are talking about a tactical thing. Hey, here's the thing that we're measuring. Here's kind of where we're at with it. Here's what we're seeing. But then also saying, but here's what I'm thinking about going forward. Here's some thoughts that I have around how we're going to be maybe approaching this in a little bit of a different way. So here's what we've learned, and then here's some of the movement that we're making in the moment right now. I think there's a lot of times when people feel like I can't share my idea or my thoughts until I've had the time to make it successful. And now that it's had some success, now I can tell you what I did. And I think for me, strategic thinking and showcasing that is simply saying, I haven't done this yet, but here's what I'm thinking, and here's an approach that I'm considering that I believe is going to have a positive impact. And again, it may not. It may be exactly what you thought it would be. It may adjust over time, but sharing ahead of time and talking about that and the ideas that you're having, I think is very powerful. I think when people hear that, they're like, oh, well, wait a minute. Like, not only is Chris talking about, kind of where they're showing up right now in this thing, but now he's also sharing what he's thinking about next. And you might say something that I say, that's a great idea. I hadn't thought about that. Or you know what, Chris, like, that's a different approach. We should spend a little bit more time talking about that. I want to know more about what you're thinking. Now we're in a place where we can actually measure and think about what is strategic thinking and how does it come to life in the moment.
Right. So again, what you said earlier, caveat it with, I haven't done this yet. Right. So as long as you say that as part of the conversation, it doesn't seem like you come off like you know what you're talking about, but just that you have thought strategically about this problem in a way that says, you know what, I'm not just looking at my, kind of myopic view about the situation. I'm considering the organization as a whole or the team as a whole, as opposed to just my own work. And even just the act of doing that before you try out whatever it is might let somebody else speak up and say, you know what, I've had that thought too. And the reason why I didn't do it is because of this. This was always the hurdle that I came across. And then they'll say what they had to say about it. And that might make you think, oh, you know what? You're right. That's not the way forward. Or it might be something that you've solved. Maybe that's a problem you've solved for. And now you have two great minds thinking together on how to solve a problem strategically, because sometimes not everybody has all the information they need in order to move forward. But if you get enough people in the same room together, the collective consciousness, the collective work that has been done individually works together to find a solution. And now you have a team of people that are thinking strategically on how to solve a problem. And maybe that's how the problem actually gets solved.
Yeah.
And the other one I want to talk about on this episode is challenging old ways of and finding new solutions. And I think this really speaks well as the next thing after training yourself to think strategically, because this thinking strategically is how you find new solutions to old problems. There's this old kind of thing that a lot of people do, and we've talked about it on other episodes. In fact, just recently we talked about it on a Thoughtful Thursday episode around active inertia, around this tendency of a lot of organizations to make the wrong decision because they're doing things the way they've always done them. And so because it was right 10 years ago or even 6 months ago, they believe it to be the right decision now. And that isn't necessarily the case. Finding solutions to problems that are better than they were when they were initially created is a fantastic way to get noticed by other people in the organization, because it shows a commitment to saying, you know what, just because someone has already solved this problem doesn't mean that we have to consider it, settled science. We have access to so much more technology now, so much more information now, so many new people that have come and gone from our teams now. It is the right time to be finding new solutions to problems that were solved years ago, and that where people do them continually in the exact same way over and over again, just because that's the way they've always done them. And if you can find a way to change that up, especially not just for the sake of change, but because it's a more efficient way, a way that takes into account what the overall larger and long-term goals of your organization is, that's a solution that will definitely get you noticed by somebody above who your direct boss is.
Yeah, I appreciate you kind of sharing that last bit there, because like people that know me know I enjoy being a little bit of a disruptor, and I love nothing more than a healthy debate and challenging kind of the norms. So like I'm all in for that approach. But I do want to clarify something, which is kind of what you were saying, is like, not every different idea is a good idea.
Just because it's different.
Just because it's different. Right. Exactly. You cannot live in that space. Like, I'm going to challenge everything. Like, it needs to change. We've been doing this. Like, yes, like there's probably some truth in that. But unless you do what you were sharing, which is like, have you done the research? Have you considered? Have you thought about the way these things can be impacted? Have you considered why maybe something hasn't changed over time? Like, it's not that it might not have to change, but you need to think about these things from a strategic thinking standpoint before you may go and challenge some of those types of norms. I do believe that a lot of norms should be challenged. We talked about this before on the podcast. Like, I love the idea of looking at your business like a curious 5-year-old. Why is that over there? Why do we do it that way? Why does that person do that? Why are they in charge of this? Like, when you start thinking about all of the questioning why we just do normal things, you will find spaces where you could probably become more efficient or more effective. I'm all for it. Where it's not helpful is asking the whys without being able to say, and here's where I've spent time researching this. Here's where I've taken these things into consideration. Here's a solution that I believe will fulfill what we're looking to accomplish while having a different approach to this. Like, those are the things that I think get the attention of other leaders around you. You do need the people that will poke holes in everything. You do need a healthy amount of really considering different approaches and pushing back on the kind of the systemic norms that can happen. But it's only, I would say it's only helpful, but it's mostly only helpful when you're considering the totality of the change and you're coming with ideas and solutions that will provide a way of maintaining what's going on and building upon that, versus just tear it all down and start over because this doesn't work for me.
Right. I love that that was your last line there, because this doesn't work for me. That's, to me, the biggest differentiator between, are you going to be viewed as just someone who's poking holes in things for the sake of poking holes, or are you going to be viewed as someone who has the organization as a whole as their North Star, what's best for the organization? If you're trying to change the way something is done because it doesn't work for you, that isn't enough. That's enough to start in terms of where do I begin my research? Because if it's a problem for you, it's likely a problem for others. But that's where the research starts. You come up with you find a problem that doesn't work for you, and instead of saying, okay, it doesn't work for me, now I'm going to poke holes in it. It doesn't work for me. Now I need to find out if it doesn't work for other people too. I need to find out if this is a problem that is shared across the organization with other people who are in my role, and why is it like that? Is it like that because this is still the best way of doing it and there's no way around it? It's just the best scenario or the best solution given all the possible solutions, which are all not very good. So this is just the best one that we have so far. Or has no one really thought about this for a long time and there's a way to make it better? But it has to be rooted in, how do I make it better for the organization? Or how do I make it better for the team? Not how do I make my life easier? This is the same thing as giving feedback to somebody. If you're giving feedback to someone based on their making your life more difficult, that's not going to land the same way as you're giving feedback to somebody based on how to help their career, how to help them progress. It lands differently. This is the exact same way. People who try to change up the way things are done and find solutions to old ways of doing things simply because they don't like doing it the way that it's currently done, there's an inherent bias that comes with anybody who's making a suggestion like that, and it will fall on a lot of deaf ears. That you will be dismissed by a lot of people simply because they'll assume you're just trying to solve your own problem, not that you're trying to solve the problems of the organization or of the team as a whole. So do your research and really get into, is this just a problem for me because I don't like the way it's being done? Whereas if I did it the right way, or I did it the way the company wants me to do it, it would come out the right way? Or is this truly an antiquated way of doing something, and other people share in my frustration, and now I can move forward with I think is a better solution because it's affecting the entire team, not just it's affecting me.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to this episode's 1-minute hack. But first, a few words from our sponsors.
All right, for this episode's 1-minute hack, here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about the most frustrating thing that you have to do in your day-to-day job, something that you wish you didn't have to do because you think it is either done incorrectly or that you don't like the way you're being asked to do it. Whatever it is, write it down, and the next time you're asked to do it, I want you to think about it through a strategic lens of, if you knew it had to get done, how would you do it differently? Not how would you get out of doing it altogether, but how would you do it differently if you still had to do it, but you could choose the way to do it. And I want you to work backwards from that endpoint and think about, what would you do differently if it had to be done that way? And then start talking to your coworkers and your peers about it from a standpoint of, hey, have we tried it this way? Or have you tried it that way? Or from a standpoint of, how can you help them do better or find an easier way of doing it? Not just complaining about, I don't like the way we do this. But think about it from a way of, how do I help the team? How do I help the organization do this thing differently if I think it could be done differently? It has to be rooted in data. You have to be able to come to people with that you've thought about this, that it's not just kind of an emotional reaction to something you don't like doing. But if you start there, you might actually find that there are some things that you can do differently, and you'll make your own life happier when it comes to your job. And you might very well get noticed by your boss's boss by changing up the way things have always been done into a way that might be a little bit more efficient, a little bit better for the organization as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's a great 1-minute hack. And, I think a lot of leaders just do this. Like, you might be listening to this, but like, I do this all the time. Or like what? Well, like that's my job as a leader. Like, yes, yeah, probably. And absolutely. And you should be. And that's kind of the idea here. I think sometimes though, I've been having a lot of conversation about this recently around, how do you build this skill? How do you bring other leaders around to know how to do this effectively? Because a lot of, probably if you think back to the times when you learned how to do this effectively, it's probably because you did something wrong. Like I can imagine many times in my life where I went and challenged something and I didn't have any of the insight, the perspective, or I didn't do any of the research. It just didn't work for me. And I pushed really heavy, or I challenged something because I was like, this is just ridiculous. I don't know why we do it this way. This makes no sense whatsoever. And then lo and behold, when I started talking to somebody who knew what the hell they were talking about, it made a lot of sense. And I was like, okay, like you have to eat crow on this one. Where it's just like, that's a lot of times how you learn in these types of spaces, is that you feel that you're doing it correctly, or you feel that they're going to have a value add. But it's not really strategic thinking, because you're not really strategically thinking about anything. You're just thinking about your emotions and what you want to happen. And so I think that episodes like this and time to reflect on things like this are critical when you think about the responsibility of helping new leaders that maybe have not had to show up in this space just yet avoid the mistakes and the pain points that we've had in our past.
Right. And there's also an added element of, there is such a thing as fatigue when it comes to changing things up. In a lot of organizations, change is constant. There are always things that are being changed up, that are being told to you or dictated to you how you have to do things differently than how it's been done. So there are people thinking strategically in ways that will impact your job every day already. And so sometimes I think a lot of leaders can get into this situation where they don't want to almost voluntarily try to change up something else, because then they have to learn how to do something new. They have to learn how to do something differently than they've always done it. And they feel like they're just inundated with constant new ways of doing things from people above them in the organization. They don't want to add their own thing to the mix too, because then it's just more things to learn, more things to be that are difficult if they're just kind of burnt out, or if they don't want to add more of that to their plate. That's a disservice to their coworkers and to their peers to do that. But that might mean that it's on you as the person who reports to a person like that to start the ball rolling on that. And if you can use that as a springboard to get noticed by other people in the organization, well, then it's a win for everybody.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.